This week we're going to cover chapters 21, 22, and 23. Although there are 3 chapters, the material is pretty straightforward and the chapters are short, so I don't think you'll find this material too difficult. Starting with the first chapter, let's talk about imitation. I think all of us probably know what we mean when we say somebody's imitating us, or the child is imitating his or her parents. So more formal definition would be that some form of a model is presented with the intent of evoking some imitative response. So the parent perhaps presents the model. The imitative response would immediately follow the model. The model and the imitative response have formal similarity. That means they resemble each other, right? If it's a gross motor response, like raising your hand as a model, the child should raise his or her hand as the imitative response. They have formal similarity. If the parent provides the model dog, verbally saying dog, the child should verbally say dog as the imitative response. So they have formal similarity. One more example there. If the parent were to write the word shoe, the child would write the word shoe as the imitative response. So all of those examples show the formal similarity, that is, the model and the imitative response resemble each other. Last, the model must be the controlling variable. So that is, when the model is presented, the response that follows, if it has formal similarity, is an occurrence of imitation. Now, there are instances where something that may have been imitated in the presence of a model occurs sometime later. You might think of it as sort of delayed imitation. Given there's such a temporal distance between the model and the actual response that's imitated, we would not really consider it a form of pure imitation. We've talked about the imitative response. Let's talk about the model. The model is our antecedent stimulus, right? So here what we're talking about is a strategy that we might use in a skill acquisition program, right? Whether it's for our learners with autism, adults with developmental disabilities, or typically developing children and our adults. Modeling and imitation is used as a method by which we teach people to do things. The model, again, is that antecedent stimulus. So we're presenting it with the intent of hopefully evoking an imitative response. Now, we'll talk about what prerequisites are needed before we could use this type of teaching approach where we're presenting models for somebody to imitate. But for now, let's just focus on the model. Planned models are going to be those that we prearranged, right, to show a learner what to do. If we're teaching somebody to play piano, we could present perhaps a video model, which we'll talk about shortly, where we're showing how to form a C chord on the piano. So that is a planned model. Unplanned models, of course, happen all the time. These are just simply events that occur, across our daily life that we may imitate in some way. So if you get a group of kids in sort of peer group, if one member of that group starts, let's just say, behaving in a particular way, you might see another member imitate that individual. So the model was not planned. The peer who is engaging in some form of behavior did not plan that model, but others may follow, right? So when we're utilizing modeling and behavior analysis, it's largely a planned model. That's not to say that through a course of a therapy session with a child that they may not begin to model other behaviors that we engage in, but planned models are going to be ones that we write up in a program. So what makes for an effective model? Well, the first thing is the immediacy, the temporal relationship between the model and the occurrence of a behavior, right? When the imitative response occurs in close temporal proximity to the model, we see that the chance of the imitative response being, let's just say, successful or correct, has a greater likelihood, right? The further away in time that you are from the model, the chances of the imitative response being correct decreases. So again, imagine we're teaching, or I'm trying to show you how to form a C chord on a piano, and I simply show you one day on a video, and then I say, now when the video ends, you go and try it. And if you don't try it for, let's just say, a half hour, you're probably not going to be able to form the same chord, right? However, if the keyboard is in front of you, the piano is in front of you, and I form the C chord, there's going to be a greater likelihood that your imitative response will be correct. And of course, reinforcement can be provided. Oops. So immediacy is one determining to the effectiveness of a model. The controlling relationship has to be the model, right? So that is the controlling relation for the imitative behavior is the model. It serves as an SD. So as I mentioned earlier, delayed imitation can occur, but it's not imitative behavior because something else evoked it, right? Not the model. Now, obviously, not all learners can learn from modeling, right? You need to have some form of an imitative repertoire. That is, you need to know, essentially, or be able to engage in imitative behavior when somebody presents a model. And we see that for some children, this requisite skill is not always present. So we may have to train imitation. And that can be kind of difficult. But nevertheless, the seminal study in 1967 by Don Baer and colleagues showed that we can reinforce behavioral similarity to models. And we can perhaps program it in such a way that we can generate what we'd call a generalized imitation repertoire, right? So imagine this, and I'll go through a protocol on the next slide. If the child cannot engage in an imitative repertoire, maybe we could teach small imitative responses, right? So let's just say hand raising, right? The therapist presents a model. We reinforce that if the learner imitates, maybe we have to use some prompting, but we get the learner to imitate the model and we provide reinforcement for imitation in the absence of any prompting, right? So independent imitation to a model. So if we train that up, that's one response. And then we train perhaps another imitative response and yet another imitative response. We may start to see generalized imitation because now we've provided the learner with a history that, oh, when I imitate this response that's being modeled, reinforcement is forthcoming. So here's a set of imitation training steps by, I believe it's Streifel in 1974. First and foremost, we want to look for the prerequisite skills, right? Can the child imitate anything? And when we're working with a client or a learner, we can do a formal assessment. We could do an informal assessment, right? If I'm working with a young child, I'm probably going to use an assessment where I present some gross motor models and maybe I say, do this, right? So I touch my head, do this. If the learner does it, they have some form of an imitative repertoire. So I want to determine the extent of that imitative repertoire. Can they imitate gross motor skills? Can they imitate fine motor skills? Can they imitate verbal behavior? Can they imitate writing behavior and so forth? So that's sort of the scope of what we're considering when we conduct such an assessment. But let's just keep things simple here and say we look for gross motor imitation and we don't see any. So now we're going to select models, right? We conduct some baseline where we present the model and maybe we see very few imitative responses. Then we're going to sequence models for training, easiest to difficult. Now, this is sort of somewhat subjective. To me, a hand raising model seems to be easy, but for a learner, it may not be. So we have to obviously somehow determine what's going to be the easiest response to imitate and which will be more difficult. And we sequence them and establish performance criteria. So again, it might be something that let's just say for this example, we determine hand raising is going to be our first model, and the performance criterion is going to be, let's just say 9 consecutive trials of independent imitation, right? Because let's say we may need to use prompting early on. So I present the model. Then let's just say I have a second therapist or a parent, and they add some prompting to have the child raise his or her hand. I say, great job. I go through that again. Maybe I have differential reinforcement for independent responding versus prompted responding. So I get the performance to the criterion, and then I will add on the next model in the sequence. So we're going to perform this imitation training, right? Again, across probably multiple trials, let's just say 10 for multiple sessions. And once we get about 1 to 3 models acquired, let's say 3 models acquired, or so that is, we're presenting models and the learner is imitating, and they can do 3 of them. Then we're going to do a test to see if the learner can imitate a new model, right? So we present one that we haven't trained, and if they engage in that model, then we might say that they've acquired a generalized imitation repertoire. So that may be an initial step to more learning. If you have a learner who cannot learn through observation, that is, they cannot learn by looking at a model and imitating, we might work on teaching generalized imitation first. Now, thus far, I've been presenting this in the context of you as a therapist or a parent presenting models to the learner. But models come in a variety of different forms. Video modeling is quite popular because it can be cost effective and it can be used over and over again. So it's pretty straightforward in the sense of all the material we just talked about is irrelevant here, but instead of the therapist presenting the models are recorded on a video. Now, there are different forms of video modeling. You can have video models where, let's put it in the context of you're working with a client and you want to teach some gross motor imitation. So rather than being present, you want to record the model. Now, you could go home and record yourself engaging in specific behaviors and then have the learner watch the video model. Or you can have peers, peers that are of the learner's age. Maybe they look like the learner to a certain extent. You could record them engaging in the behavior. So maybe typically developing kids serve as the model. And there's some evidence to show that that may be more engaging for some learners to watch a peer engage in these behaviors than it would for you as an adult to engage in the behavior. There's also video self-modeling. And in fact, with the availability of pretty powerful video editing software, we can actually record videos of the learner engaging in behavior that is prompted, and we could edit out the prompts, right? So the final product looks like the learner engaging in a particular behavior. And again, we're talking about, it could be gross motor behavior, it could be fine motor behavior, vocal responses, long phrases. Imagine we want to teach the learner to say, excuse me, please, what time is it? So we could create a video where we prompt each word in that phrase and then we could edit our prompts out of that video. So what the learner sees in the final video is themselves saying, "Excuse me, what time is it, please?" Then we could take that video and maybe perhaps place it in a device, load it onto a device or a phone, and work on teaching the learner to request information, right? So we set up the video, we play the video for them, then we prompt them to walk over to a peer and recite what was on the video. Okay, so those are some examples there. There's also point of view, right? So if I were, for example, teaching a learner to write the word dog, I could video myself writing dog and show it to them, or video a peer writing dog and have them watch the video. Or I could just have it be a point of view as if the learner themselves were writing, right? So the hands are present, the paper's present, the pen is present, rather than a full person. Okay, so not unlike with some of the things we talked about with respect to prompting, and in a sense, this is a prompt of sorts, it's a model. We want to be able to fade this stuff out. So it might be the case that point of view videos serve that purpose in that it minimizes the amount of other stimuli that can come to control responding. And then again, going back to this slide, imagine yourselves trying to learn something complex. Again, I'm kind of focusing on playing a piano because I'm teaching my daughter to do so. It may be easier to literally see just a hand on the keys in the video as opposed to the full person and a room and all these other stimuli. Okay, so that's really it on imitation and modeling. And this is really kind of within the context of observational learning, right? As humans, we're not the only ones. Other organisms engage in this as well. But as humans, we do learn quite a bit by observing others engaging in certain behaviors. So observational learning specifically is detecting another person's behavior and its consequences and using that information to determine whether or not to imitate the behavior, right? So, being college students, or maybe not graduate students, but as an undergrad, I'm sure you've watched a lot of your friends do things and either decided, wow, maybe I'll do that, or definitely not going to do that, because you've seen the model, the behavior, and then, of course, the consequences that follow. The next chapter in our discussion of skill acquisition or teaching new behaviors involves shaping. So if we could model a behavior and have our learner imitate that behavior, that is a pretty direct way of teaching. But what do we do if there is no initial behavior from the learner? That is, if the behavior is not in his or her repertoire, and maybe he or she does not have an imitation repertoire. What do we do there? Well, shaping represents yet another approach that we could use when we're teaching new behaviors. The definition of shaping is the modification of response topography through differential reinforcement of successive approximations. Now, that definition is pretty important because it highlights the fact that what we're doing when we shape behavior is we're differentially reinforcing approximations to a final target behavior. So if, for example, I'm trying to teach a learner to raise his or her hand, and during my shaping session, his or her hand is on the desk, I'm going to reinforce any response variation, right? So just imagine a hand flat on the desk and the learner moves the hand. I'm going to provide reinforcement because what that's going to do is generate some change in behavior. Now, it doesn't look like a hand raise, of course, but we're going to get there slowly but surely. So once I I'm able to increase the hand moving perhaps off the desk to any degree, then I'm going to place that behavior on extinction. And what that'll do, because now there's been a history of reinforcement for moving the hand, let's just say a short distance from the desk, because the behavior is now contacting extinction, it's going to produce further response variation. So let's just say the learner it now moves their hand 6 inches from the desk. I'm going to reinforce that, right? So what I've done there is first I've shaped a little change in the response topography. Then I put that behavior on extinction and I reinforce a closer approximation to the target behavior. Once I'm able to generate that, I'm going to place that behavior on extinction, and I'm only going to reinforce even closer approximations to the target behavior until I get to the final target. So in a way, shaping is, I always sort of refer to it as where behavior analysis meets art, because there isn't necessarily a specific criterion that one follows when shaping in terms of when do we reinforce and when do we place a behavior on extinction. It does take some skill to learn how to do this and do it efficiently. So, differential reinforcement of successive approximations to a target behavior. We're going to use shaping when a response is unlikely to occur. It's not, the individual has not acquired it yet. It's not in the repertoire. Or the response is not responsive to just direct instruction, do this, for example, or modeling. The dimensions of behavior that can be shaped include, as we just discussed, the topography, right? So what the form of the response looks like. And again, I want to emphasize that it is a process. The reinforcement is for any behavior that comes close to the target behavior. We could actually shape the frequency of behavior, right? We could increase the number of responses. We could shape the latency, the time between some antecedent, like an instruction perhaps, and the response, the duration and magnitude, the force or strength of a response. So all of these can be shaped using differential reinforcement. So while shaping can be used to teach new behaviors, clearly it could be inadvertently at play when challenging behavior, problematic behaviors are shaped. And we've talked about this in our ABA 510 course, where problematic behavior can be unintentionally shaped up. So imagine this example, 3-year-old child in the grocery store. And there's candy at eye level. So you may see the child initially respond, I want candy. Right? And as a good parent, you don't want your child to eat too much sugar, so you refuse to get them the candy. Then there's another more intense behavior. They're perhaps yelling, I want candy, please. Right? And good parent, you don't want them to have sugar, so you ignore them. Then they start saying, I'm hungry. You ignore that. Then they scream, and you ignore that. And then you get this terminal response, perhaps terminal. This is just an example. They scream repeatedly, try to get out of the shopping cart. Maybe they do. They roll on the floor. They have this big tantrum. And as, a good parent, you don't want to disrupt the grocery store, so you buy them the candy. So what happens here is you've inadvertently shaped up more problematic behavior. Now, again, sometimes this type of example is unavoidable, so I'm not blaming parents in any way. Fortunately, I have not been in this situation with my daughter, but that it is what it is. Sometimes it happens. So the elements of the contingency here would be as such that there's an EO, child hasn't had candy for some time, they're sighted the candy in the grocery store, so that's an SD. For a horrible temper tantrum to take place, such that the parent will deliver candy contingent on the tantrum, because you want the tantrum to go away. The only way to make it go away is to provide the candy. So although we don't intentionally shape problematic behavior, this might be one example of how shaping is at play when you see problematic behavior occurring. So shaping is very effective. It is, however, time consuming, and progress is not always linear, right? So in the, not the last example of problem behavior I described, but the hand raising example, I sort of described it in a linear fashion where by chance the student's hand comes off the desk, right? From the desk to, let's just say they move it, right? Maybe an inch off the desk. You're going to provide reinforcement for that. When you get that response occurring consistently and then you place it on extinction, again, to produce response variation, the response variations aren't going to be linear. That is, the hand isn't suddenly going to go from raising 1 inch off the desk to raising 5 inches off the desk. It could go all the way up to a hand raise. And obviously, we would want to provide reinforcement for that. Or they can begin scratching their head. So, as a behavior analyst or the person doing the shaping, you have to determine, well, am I going to reinforce that? Because it is sort of an approximation to getting their hand up in the air. Clearly it's off the desk, but they're doing something else. So you have to really be diligent in determining what responses are going to be reinforced and what responses are going to be placed on extinction. And through the behavior change projects, you will see examples of shaping. So you have to be skillful. You have to know when to progress from reinforcement to extinction. And of course, shaping can be at play. It often is at play with challenging behaviors. Once again, just to expand on that point, we talked about some children with developmental disabilities having compromised abilities to speak. So if you cannot communicate for things that you need and want, you may engage in problematic behavior. And again, parents inadvertently may shape these behaviors. Shaping and fading both change behavior gradually. Again, this is a gradual process, and you can't say how long it will take. You definitely have to determine, though, if shaping is the best way to go. You want to be able to shape behavior relatively quickly and move on to teaching other things. So let's look at a shaping protocol. The first thing you'd want to do is select and define the terminal response. The terminal response is the target behavior. So in my example of hand raising, the terminal behavior is going to be defined in some way. Let's just say arm fully extended in an upward direction, hand above the head, something of that nature. And then we're going to determine a criterion for success. What does it look like when we reach that terminal response? We want to analyze the response class and identify approximation. So again, if we think about this, we don't have to go through and identify every approximation to getting the hand in an up, or the arm in an upward direction with the hand above the head. But we want to have a general idea of what all the intermediate responses may look like. So again, if the hand starts on the desk, raising it 1 inch off the desk is an approximation. Reaching down to the floor might not be an approximation, right? Scratching your nose might be an approximation. But again, you could inadvertently shape the behavior in another direction. So you have to kind of figure out what responses are going to receive reinforcement. Then are they being maintained? And if so, then you want to switch them to extinction. So identify the first behavior to reinforce. That's probably the best place to start. Proceed in gradual steps. And obviously, if the terminal response does occur because extinction produces response variation, you want to provide reinforcement for that. Clicker training might be familiar to some of you who have dogs or other pets, because it is it's something that's been used for a while to shape animal behavior, but it is more and more being used in human instances. So it's simply a science-based approach to shaping using positive reinforcement and extinction, again, differential reinforcement, And the clicker is basically something you hold in your hand that produces a sound. The great thing about clickers is they are essentially conditioned reinforcement. By pairing them with food, so click food, the learner or the animal begins to associate the click with food. So it becomes a conditioned reinforcer. Therefore, it could be delivered immediately contingent upon correct approximations. Again, one of the challenges with shaping is, let's just imagine you're using edible reinforcement. Once you see the correct response, you have to deliver the edible reinforcement, and it takes some time to perhaps get it in the learner's hand or maybe directly into their mouth, and then they have to chew and so forth. So a clicker is a bit more immediate. Now, again, it is conditioned reinforcement. You have to follow up with the edible reinforcement. All right, I will post this link on Blackboard so you'll have a chance to see some shaping at play, and we'll move on to the next section. So thus far we talked about imitation and modeling and observational learning and shaping as ways in which we could teach new behavior. And of course, again, positive reinforcement can be used to teach new behavior, being used in a differential reinforcement format in the context of shaping. Chaining is another procedure we might use when teaching new responses or more complex responses. So a behavioral chain is a sequence of responses functionally linked to the same terminal reinforcer. That is, it is a sequence of behaviors that produce some final reinforcement, and all of them are linked to that terminal reinforcer. What you see in a behavior chain, well, let's go through this little example here. So there might be an EO for something and an SD upon which, if we engage in certain responses, reinforcement is likely. Then you see one response that leads to the ability to perform another response, which leads to the ability to perform another response, and so forth, until you get to this terminal response that produces reinforcement. So in this example, each response has a dual function. It serves as a conditioned reinforcer for the previous response and a discriminative stimulus for the next response or the latter response. So if you think of it, it's sort of like opening a door to get into the building is a response, and getting into the building is a conditioned reinforcer for opening the door. But it's also a discriminative stimulus for the next step in whatever the sequence of entering the building is, maybe getting into your office and having lunch or something like that. So when we utilize behavioral chains, or when we're teaching behavioral chains, we typically break the complex skill down into a task analysis, sometimes referred to as task analyzing the behavior chain. So we're breaking a complex skill or series of behaviors into smaller, more teachable units of behavior. And you could get pretty complex with task analyses if needed. Maybe some learners, you do need to get that complex, or you could get sort of broad. So here I have using an automatic teller machine or automatic banking machine. There are steps involved. And this is a great example of how each functions as a conditioned reinforcement for the previous response and the discriminative stimulus for the next response. So again, all of us, I think, are familiar with using this type of a machine. So you first see the machine, you walk up, you put in your card, and then instructions come up. So access to those instructions are a conditioned reinforcer for inserting your card. Then they are an SD for what to do next. You enter your PIN number, right? Then it brings you to the transaction screen. So the access to the transaction screen is a conditioned reinforcer for entering your PIN and an SD for the next step. You select the amount, select the receipt option, retrieve cash, select return card, retrieve card. Obviously machines have some different sequences, but this is a general process here. So imagine if you used an ATM machine and you inserted your card and the instructions didn't come up, right? So now inserting the card has been placed on extinction. So you're not contacting condition reinforcement. So that's an example of why gaining access to the next sequence in the complex chain of behaviors is a condition reinforcer. Here's another one, doing laundry. Again, this one is broad, but we could probably even get into a little more detail. So let's just say we start with a full basket of clothes. You carry the basket to the laundry area. You separate lights and darks. You place the lights in the washer. You select the light setting, put in detergent, close the lid, press start. All right, just again, another example of behavior chains that end up in some terminal reinforcement. Right? And again, the reinforcement doesn't always have to be an edible item or praise. Just simply having the laundry being washed might be a reinforcer. Or obviously, the ultimate reinforcer is getting through the wash process, putting them in the dryer, getting them out, and having clean clothes. So there are a couple chaining procedures that we might use or that we can use in different instances. Forward chaining is when the first link is taught initially and then subsequent links are added from beginning to front from the back of a chain. The advantage is it retains the temporal order of the behavior chain or the performance. The disadvantage is reinforcement is provided prior to completing the chain. So let's go back to this laundry example. If I were teaching a learner how to do their laundry using forward chaining, the first thing I would work on is having them carry the basket to the laundry area. Once they get there, I'm going to say, hey, great job. Maybe I'll provide some other supplemental reinforcement, and then I will complete the remainder of the steps. Let's just say I'm teaching weekly. So the next week I do it again. The next week I do it again. And now I have 3 consecutive weeks where they independently carry the basket to the laundry area. Then I'm going to add the next step. So I'm going to teach this step. So next week rolls around, they carry their basket, great job. Now I have them separate lights and darks. After they do that consecutively for, let's not say weeks, let's just say 3 instances of doing laundry, then I'm going to add the next step and so forth. So I'm progressing in a forward fashion until I get to the final step. And this can, again, occur over a long period of time. So that's forward chaining. Backward chaining, as you might imagine, the last link is taught initially and subsequent links are added from back to front. So let's go back to our example. Here, I'm going to do these steps. I'm going to carry the basket. I'm going to separate lights and darks. I'm going to place lights in the washer, select the setting, put in detergent, close lid, and I'm going to then teach the learner to press start. Again, contingent on consistent performance for X amount of sessions. Then I will add this next to last step. So I will go through the following steps. Then when I get to closing the lid, I will teach the learner to do that. And then they will close the lid and then they'll press start, right? After that maintains, I'm going backwards in this case. So the advantage is that the reinforcement always follows the completion of the terminal link, right? And that's ultimately what we want. We want the behavior chain to occur and then reinforcement comes at the end of the link. So wherein in forward chaining, the reinforcement comes earlier in the chain because we're teaching forward to back. Here, we're teaching the last links first and then moving backwards. The disadvantage here, and this is the same disadvantage with forward chaining, is that acquisition on earlier links may go unnoticed. So again, these behavioral chains, the acquisition of each behavior in the chain may not be linear, right? So let's again, once again, go back to doing laundry. It could be the case that, let's just say, the learner can put clothes in the washer, right? They know to put the light clothes in, let's just say first, and they could also put the detergent in, but they can't yet carry the laundry basket, separate lights and darks, close the lid, press start. Maybe they just haven't learned to do that. So if we're using forward chaining or backward chaining, we're going to miss the fact that they already know to do these things until we actually get to that step, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Therefore, we have another procedure, and one that I tend to favor, total task presentation. That is, we're simply going to teach the entire chain simultaneously and provide assistance as needed. Maybe we use graduated guidance as prompting, right? So this allows for the uneven acquisition of the response chain. So let's go back once again. So in this case, I'm going to, if I'm teaching doing laundry, let's just say I prompt the learner, carry the basket to the laundry area, and they don't do it. So maybe I use graduated guidance and start to teach that. We get the basket to the laundry area. I say separate lights and darks. They don't engage in a behavior or they do something incorrectly. I'm going to guide them and teach that part of the response. Then I say, put the light clothes in the washer, and they do it, right? So great. Now that's an independent part of this chain that's been completed. I say, select the light setting. They select something else, and I teach them in that moment how to select lights, put the detergent in. In fact, they do it. Great job. Close the lid. Maybe they do that. Press start. They don't do anything. So I teach them. So what we're doing in total task is simply going through the steps. If it occurs independently, fantastic. If it doesn't, we teach on the spot, and we just repeat that over the course of several sessions. Okay, so it does allow for that uneven response acquisition. The thing is, it does involve the greatest response requirement, right? Because you're teaching all the things at once as opposed to a sequence. So one isn't necessarily better than the other, but you have the ability to use any of these when you're teaching new behaviors. Okay, again, I have another link. It's not a YouTube video, it's a TED Talk, which is actually a fun talk. It's really interesting. I will post that one as well. So as I mentioned, these chapters were pretty straightforward. We will meet next week, and if folks have questions on these chapters, feel free to ask. But again, I encourage you to watch the supplemental videos, as I think it'll help make sense of some of this material. Okay, have a great week.